Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. It's episode 2629 of The Tom Woods Show, and we have a doozy for you today. I'm very happy to be joined by two gentlemen I have known for quite some time. Gene Epstein, since probably at least 2010, and John Carney. I've known you for, if you can believe it, 30 years.
Yeah, that's about 30 years when we met, I think, Tom.
Yeah, in 1995, I had graduated from Harvard. You were spending a year there. We were in the dining hall. We met, and everyone else left, and you and I stayed there talking for a long time. So it's very interesting that here you are on my little humble little show.
And we're going to talk about. Is this your first time on Tom's show, John?
It is.
Yeah, I can't believe 2,600 episodes, and this is my very first time. But
look, John, I would love to have you more. But all the same, what we're talking about today is the Trump tariffs.
Yeah,
and that. Well, hang on, Gene. That subject has generated an enormous amount of social media commentary. Let's say a lot of it very, very aggressive, and shedding sometimes more heat than light, as well as a lot of speculation on what the strategy behind the tariffs is, if indeed there is one. And so I want to talk to two people here, one who is deeply skeptical of this program and another who is supportive. So Gene, I'm going out of order, but Gene Epstein, who's been a guest on the Tom Woods Show many times, is director of the Soho Forum, formerly economics and book review editor at Barron's, senior economist at the New York Stock Exchange, many credentials. And then John Carney of Breitbart, which he joined after being with the Wall Street Journal. And I got to know John, I guess, shortly after you and I met. You became research director for Pat Buchanan on his 1996 campaign. Right. And as that campaign was winding down and they were letting people go, you were like one of the last ones to be let go. You were on to the end. It was great having, I don't want to say a mole, but a friend somewhere in that campaign. So what I want to do is I don't want to do a formal, stuffy debate. Not that there's anything wrong with formal, stuffy debates. That's what Gene Epstein does for a living. But instead, I'd like each of you, starting with John, to take maybe 10 or 15 minutes and give us an overview of why we should agree with your perspective, what your perspective is. And then I just want to facilitate a conversation with the two of you. So, John, how does that sound?
That sounds great.
Okay. You first.
Okay. So what I would say is that for many, many years, the U.S. has been on an unsustainable path when it comes to world trade. A question is just historically, I think it helps for people to understand, how did we get here? Why did we end up in a situation in which every other country in the world was allowed to have tariffs on the U.S., was allowed to have trade barriers on U.S. goods, but the U.S. basically just ignored all that? We allowed trade deficits to grow from what people back in the Reagan era thought were unsustainable levels to 300 times that, if you calculate it, whether in terms of inflation-adjusted numbers or in terms of GDP. We're way beyond what even Ronald Reagan actually worried about a little bit. So how did we get here? Well, it was really a form of charity by the U.S., a strategic charity, call it. During the Cold War, we wanted to make sure that all of our allies were enriched. We didn't want France to go communist. We didn't want Western Germany to go communist. Now, in retrospect, that sounds ridiculous. Everybody says, of course, that we were going to win the Cold War. It didn't look like that in 1948. It looked like that we could lose. The rest of the world, particularly Europe, but also large parts of Asia, had been absolutely devastated, wrecked. How do we rebuild their economy? Well, one way we had, very formal things, the Marshall Plan. We were lending money, we were giving money. But the other thing we allowed to happen was we allowed them to use our very healthy, because remember, we didn't get bombed during the war, our very healthy consumer base to accept their excess production. They couldn't pay for all of the stuff that would keep all of their people employed. So what did they need to do? They needed some place to sell everything to. And we took that on the chin for all of the Cold War. And it was a strategy. It was intended to make our allies rich and at a cost to ourselves, just like NATO was. NATO was a cost to the U.S., but a cost we were willing to bear. What happens when the Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union collapses, is that we had imbued the ideology that we had promoted this through, and we forgot about the strategic part. The strategic part went away. We should have been rethinking this almost immediately. And frankly, that's what I was helping do on the Pat Buchanan campaign. It's what attracted me to the Buchanan campaign in the 1990s, was Pat said, as early as 1992, 1991, hey, why are we doing the Cold War thing anymore when we should be doing the post-Cold War thing? Let us say to our trading partners around the world, guys, that was great. We're not going to allow your state-directed economies to take income out of the United States anymore. That we were okay with that during the Cold War. The other thing is that you're on your feet now. You don't need U.S. charity anymore. You can pay for your own defense through NATO, and you can consume your own production. Not necessarily literally where they have to consume everything they make, but they can consume the equivalent of their own production. So what Donald Trump is doing is, I think, the long overdue correction to this now 3-decade-long overdue policy where we should have abandoned it a long time ago. We're doing it now. It's more painful now than if we had done it when Pat Buchanan told us back in 1995. And it'll be more painful if we wait another 10 years to do it, but it has to be done.
All right, John, thank you. Now, Gene, the floor is yours.
Well, first, let me correct your facts a little bit there, John. I'm a data man. You know that, having apparently read me from the 25 years I covered the economy at Barron's. And I have in front of me the trade deficit, real net exports of goods and services. And the fact is that we had a balanced trade, and indeed up until 1976 we were balanced. The U.S. did not go into a deficit situation with any persistence until the mid 1970s. And what is a sort of called a trade deficit? It's simply that we buy, and most recently we bought about $4 trillion worth of goods and services from countries abroad, and we sold 3.2 trillion to them. So there was about an 800 in real terms, about an 800 nominal dollars, about an 800 billion, 0.8 trillion deficit. Now, what did the foreigners do with that money, and what have they been doing with that money? They could buy our goods and services, but instead, they do a number of interesting things that are not easy for us to control. Number one, they like to buy our debt. And I'm going to get especially our treasury debt. Although, by the way, they also like to buy our stock market. They also like to buy our private sector debt. So you use those dollars not to buy goods and services. You use those dollars to invest in the United States. Now, the unhealthy and unsustainable part of it is that they buy a lot of our treasuries. More than 1/3 of the debt held by the public is held by foreigners. And I'm going to get to that in a moment, because there I do indeed think that we've got an unsustainable situation. However, the other part of it is that so many economies are dollarized. Another number, because I look things up, there's $2.2 trillion worth of cash is floating around the world. Do you know that comes to $70,000 for every man, woman, and child in the U.S.? Economies are going increasingly dollarized. So what else do they do with those dollars? In other words, again, they they sell us $4 trillion worth. We buy 3.2 trillion worth, and what they do with those dollars is that they keep them. They dollarize. They engage in certain things that I think should be legal, like drugs, but also, of course, as you know, many economies are dollarized. So they do that with our dollars. But now let me get to the obvious fact that what you are defending is something that we know. We have the known and the unknown. The known is that these tariffs are doing us a considerable amount of harm. Even as we speak, we're going into a bear market. And by the way, interestingly enough, one of the reasons why the stock markets are collapsing, our stock market in particular is collapsing, hurting those working class people that you and I care about, because an awful lot of money is in pension funds. They're getting hurt. And also, as well, obviously, if you start taxing imports, then the $4 trillion worth of imports, or however many of that $4 trillion is going to be taxed, the consumer is going to have to spend more on goods and services. In an interview, you conceded that. So the harm, the evil is palpable. Now the burden on you is to say, well, somewhere down the road, this will be okay. So now I'm going to take the libertarian data approach, and I'm going to say that a deficit is bad. A trade deficit is bad if it's caused by the following things. Number one, manufacturing, by the way, contrary to, and I've corrected so many people on Twitter, manufacturing is near a record high in the United States. Domestic manufacturing. It hasn't risen as fast as GDP, but it is at a record high. It's double, triple, and quadruple where the New York Times said it was in the heyday of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So manufacturing is indeed at a record high. But that's not good enough for libertarians like me. Do you know why manufacturing hasn't grown as fast? A key reason why? Because literally, a third of $1 trillion worth of regulatory strangulation has been imposed on manufacturing. We've got to lift that. That's something that the Trump administration has made feints in that direction toward doing, but it's got to go much further. So we would have much more manufacturing, even though, again, this idea that our manufacturing has been hollowed out. No, all that's really happened, of course, is that 9% of our private sector employment is in manufacturing. It used to be much higher, but it's been falling since the late 1940s. Manufacturing has been the poster child of greater productivity. However, there's no question that if we lifted all of this strangulation on manufacturing the government has been imposing, we would have more manufacturing, we'd have cheaper goods, and we would have certainly a narrower trade deficit. But that has nothing to do with tariffs. Mining. We are rich in minerals. Mining has also been strangulated by regulation. The Trump administration is making moves in that direction. It's got to lift it. We can be rich in raw materials, far richer than ever before. We do mining, but we have vast mining deposits. So that's the second thing we need to do. And then, of course, the other obvious thing we need to do is to end the fiscal deficits that have led to the unsustainable situation in which our debt has grown so much faster than GDP. And as the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projects, it's going to grow to a point where we will face a fiscal crisis. Let me give you a few libertarian radical ideas. We have got to live by the principle that we fight wars of choice and not wars of necessity. Wow. Reverse. We've got to live by the principle that we fight wars of necessity and never wars of choice. We've got to shut down something like 3,000 bases abroad. We've got to phase out our aggressive military. That will save like $1 trillion right there. Another shocker I'll throw at you. Do you know that the federal government owns nearly $2 trillion worth of land, including national parks? They should be auctioned off slowly, judiciously. Then we have to abolish the Department of Education. We've got to abolish HUD. We've got to abolish the SEC. I'll shock you with all of those statements. We can very easily make it so that we have a balanced budget within a year or two. And then what will happen is that the debt will gradually shrink because those bonds will mature and disappear. We will no longer be adding to the debt. Now, what will that do to the trade deficit? It will mean then that the foreigners will no longer have the opportunity or any great incentive to buy our debt because it will be shrinking. They might buy it, but there will be certainly a lot less of it to go around. So we need to do all of those things. And then will we still have a trade deficit? Or we also have to drill, baby, drill. I forgot that part of it. Manufacturing depends on energy. And we have a situation in which if you buy oil from Venezuela, you're going to get tariffs thrown on you. No, we want Venezuela to drill, baby, drill. We want the whole world to do so. We want cheap energy in order to empower our manufacturing sector. So we want to do that as well. There are a few other things I could add, but you didn't use a lot of time, so I'm not going to use it. But I want to conclude on one point. The one point is that there are sick and healthy aspects to a trade deficit. The idea that we sell fewer goods and services, that fewer goods and services go to foreigners than we get from foreigners is hardly a subsidy. It's a subsidy to us. We get more from them than they give to us. And one of the big reasons why is that they like to invest in us. And if we do all of the things that I suggested, the trade deficit could easily persist. Why? Because Europe screws things up royally. It's a past master at doing that. Because the rest of the world has problems, and because when you've got dollars, you dollarize. When you've got dollars, you invest in the United States because the U.S. economy that I would create would be a far better vehicle for investment. So while there would be fewer treasuries to buy, there would be far more corporates, far more. By the way, enormous chunks of our stock market is owned by foreigners and by pension funds. Even more of it would be if you institute what I've done. So, to conclude, the trade deficit is a problem only insofar as we have a sick economy. Turn it into a healthy economy in the way that I suggested, and we'll boost manufacturing, we'll boost our economy, but we still might and probably will continue to have a trade deficit, but no longer for the wrong reasons, only for the right reasons. I rest my case.
All right, John, I want to give you a chance to respond to what Gene said. However, you are forbidden to debate him on selling off the national parks, or we'll never get back to the topic at hand. Hey, everybody, I don't know how much one podcaster can improve your life, but, when that podcaster is all woods, the answer is a lot. I'm about to tell you about my friends at Federated Computer who are going to save you a bundle. They're changing the way businesses buy software. We all need software to run our business, but the best business software does not have to cost you thousands of dollars each month. The typical Federated Computer customer saves 75% or more on their software bill, gets great software, top-notch customer service and support, and a software solution that is uniquely installed for your business and without any surveillance or breaches of privacy. For example, if you use Google for email, Salesforce for CRM, Slack for team chat, ListMonkey for customer communications, and Airtable for data management, with a team of 10, you'd save $9,000 per year on software costs switching to Federated Computer. And what's wild, the cost of Federated Computer doesn't grow as your team grows. You can use your Federated Computer savings to grow your business rather than feed the woke Silicon Valley software companies. The Federated Computer team invented computing in the cloud. Now they're taking a hammer to the ridiculously high prices of business software and have many, many satisfied customers to prove they deliver. Federated Computer has been a longtime supporter of the Tom Woods Show. They're offering 30% off their already low prices when you use coupon code WOODS. So go to www.federated.computer to begin to save 75% or more on your monthly software costs. That's www.federated.computer. These folks are going to do you a big, big favor. Check them out. And then when you guys have hashed things out a little bit, I'm not really a moderator. This is just I'm just the host here, but I have a question for each of you. But John, go ahead.
Sure. First of all, I agree with most of what Gene said. So this is like a totally disappointing debate.
No. Wait till it goes on.
Almost all of what he said, I think, is correct about needing to reorient both our defense budget and the size of our government. We do strangle our manufacturing with regulation, and much more so than people think. Just to give a really good example, if you want to hire people into manufacturing, the amount of money you have to pay to unemployment insurance to just get a new person on is so much more than if you want to open a coffee shop, because of the cyclicalness of manufacturing, where people tend to get laid off in downturns. And so it becomes much more costly to hire people into these jobs. That's a tax that we're imposing on ourselves. We complain about other countries' tariffs, and I think rightfully so, but we impose tariffs on our own manufacturing in terms of over-regulation, a lot of environmental regulation, a lot of labor regulation, a lot of this unemployment insurance. We make it very hard to hire into manufacturing. And so, yes, there is a very good point to say, how can we complain about jobs going overseas when we are pushing jobs overseas? So I think that's a very, very good point. However, I think that even if we did all of that, we will still run enormous and unsustainable trade deficits, because other countries, China and Germany in particular, but Europe in general, want to and demand to run a trade surplus against the U.S. They will do everything in their power to make sure that their consumption level stays below their production level, and that therefore they need to have us be the consumer of last resort for their economies. So we can change everything we want, and they will still manipulate their economies in such a way that we are importing a massively more goods than we are exporting to them. They will not accept anything even close to a balanced trade unless we force them to, which is why we have the tariff program that Donald Trump is putting in place. The second point I'll make is that I think Gene actually gets the causation backwards when it comes to the budget deficit. The budget deficit and the debt of the federal government is not the thing that feeds the trade deficit. It is actually the product of the trade deficit. When you have a trade deficit, income is leaking out of your economy. Everybody's income in the United States is somebody else's spending. When you're spending more on income that goes out of the economy because you have a trade deficit, you need to fill the hole, or your economy will shrink, wages will fall, and unemployment will rise. How do you fill that hole? Well, it gets filled by government spending. If we shrink the trade deficit, the political demand for the budget deficit will go away. So I actually think that the way to a smaller government is through a smaller trade deficit. That's really important. I think a lot of libertarians get that wrong. The other thing I'll say from a libertarian perspective is what we have seen over the course of the growth of worldwide trade. I hesitate to call it free trade because, as I said, I don't think there's a lot free about it. I think it's actually government managed trade all over the world. What we have seen with the growth of globalized trade is the growth of government, the growth of international government, and the growth of domestic government. So I don't think that's accidental. These things have grown together. So if you want a more libertarian world, you need a economy that is not so much focused on shipping a production abroad and then setting global trade rules and global organizations. I learned this from the late, great Murray Rothbard, that NAFTA was a problem, and he opposed to NAFTA because it was creating new forms of government rather than allowing free trade. Right now, that is the system that we are overthrowing. We are deciding the rules here rather than in Beijing or Berlin, which is what had been happening for a very long time. That's my rebuttal, I guess.
All right. Well, let me start with a few things. Thanks, John. Number one, the way to balance the budget is to take Doge and multiply it many times. We need to abolish HUD. The libertarian solution is to take Doge and take it and make it into enormous capital letters. We need to recognize that the U.S. government should fight wars of necessity, but never wars of choice. We need to shrink. We need to withdraw our bases from abroad. So that will cut our spending. We need to abolish all kinds of unnecessary agencies that tend to do more harm than good. That's the libertarian radical solution. And all of that is possible. So therefore, if we are no longer incurring fiscal deficits, our debt will shrink, and there will be no longer any reason for foreigners to buy our debt. So therefore, that's the solution. That's what we can do domestically.
So can I interrupt for 1 second? Because I think this is a very important point. I believe that foreigners buy our debt not because they want our debt. I believe they buy it because they want an economy that runs a trade surplus, and they have no choice but to buy it. So what they want is to overproduce. They need somebody to be the consumer of last resort for them. That's us. They end up with excess dollars, but that is a side effect. It is not a demand for dollars. It is a side effect of how they want their economy to be run. And then they go buy our debt because it pays a little bit more in interest than it does if they just hold the dollars straight out.
I'm not clear. I said they will no longer be able to buy our debt because our debt is going to shrivel. So therefore, that the libertarian solution is to make it so that there's less and less of our debt to buy. That's the libertarian solution. The libertarian solution is to shrink government to the point where we ourselves are paying down our debt. That's the solution. So therefore, I assume you recognize that I've finessed the point. There's nothing there, guys, for you to buy. So you're not going to buy our debt anymore because we're shrinking our debt. We are going to recognize that we've got all kinds of superfluous agencies that should be shut down. We should shut down HUD. We've got to withdraw our military presence from abroad, and therefore we're going to start running surpluses and run down our debt to hopefully to zero. But it's going to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink, and it's going to become more and more difficult for them to buy it. That's all. That's our initiative. So that's what we've got to do. And that's quite doable because there is so much government waste. So I'm not clear where, if you seem to be nodding, so I'm not clear where we are disagreeing. Again, what I also said, of course, is that we can shrink our debt down to nothing, and we don't have to incur deficits anymore. And we therefore do not have. We will no longer have a problem if we take the initiative to do those things. That's all. So where then are we disagreeing? I'm not clear why you disagree with me then.
I'd like you to come to the U.S. Virgin Islands with me and no, not aboard a cruise. For 2 years, I've run the Tom Woods Elite Mastermind, where smart and ambitious people help each other maximize their business success. Forget the vague generalities and the fortune cookie maxims you get in business books. Here, you'll get ideas and strategies designed specifically for you. My own success has been dramatically increased when smart people who knew my specific situation told me, do this specific thing. We meet in person 3 times a year, always in an exciting place, and one of our meetings in the coming year will take place in St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. We'll sail around paradise as we help each other reach that next level in our businesses. And a certain magician who fooled Penn and Teller on their TV show will be there to do close-up magic just for our small group. If that sounds awesome, that's because it obviously is. If you want in, head over to woodsmastermind.com and let's talk. woodsmastermind.com.
So we don't disagree on the desirability of all that.
Desirability.
What we disagree on is the means to get there. I think it cannot happen without a reduction in the trade deficit. And I think the reduction in the trade deficit cannot happen without tariffs, without something that the U.S. government does to rebalance trade. Why do I think this? Because I think that right now we have a national industrial policy that was designed in Beijing and designed in Berlin, that we do not have anything close to free trade. What we have is government managed trade by the communists in China and by the mercantilists in Germany. And so what can we do to respond to that? And I think that this trade deficit creates a political demand that is insatiable as long as you have the trade deficit for a budget deficit, for higher government, larger government, bigger government spending to fill in the hole in national income created by the trade deficit. So, because I've heard the argument, yes, let's just shrink government. But I've heard that for my entire life, and I've been a supporter of that point of view. Why does it fail? Why do we not shrink the government? Why is even just the slight, Doge is just, shaving away at the edges, and we have, the loudest screaming possible. The idea, when the Department of Education was put in place, Ronald Reagan ran against it. He said he was going to abolish it. He never abolished it. Neither did George Bush. Neither did his son, George Bush. Donald Trump didn't even try in his first term. It's not clear that there's even votes in Congress, even though we have Republican majorities, to abolish the Department of Education. What can we do to shrink government? Everything we've done, including making your very good case there, Gene, that we should do it, has failed. I think what we can do, the thing that hasn't been paid attention to, is the demand for large government, which emerges from the income hole in the government created by the trade deficit. If we address that, then we can get to the world that you were describing, where we can bring down the size of government, bring down the debt, bring our soldiers home from all over the country, get them involved in private sector business. We're in total agreement on that. Remember, I worked for Pat Buchanan in the 1990s. We were on the cutting edge of saying that America is overcommitted militarily, that we have too big of a government. I believe in the libertarian response. What I am saying is that the pathway, the gateway, has a big sign above it. And that sign says trade deficit. And the key to unlocking that gate is a tariff that makes the rest of the world give up their mercantilist policy.
I'm sorry. Well, obviously, if it's odd, I'm not clear where we disagree and where we agree. Now we seem to be compatriots to some degree.
We are
obviously. The problem with tariffs is that it creates a trade war. The problem with tariffs is that you've got counter tariffs. I believe with Milton Friedman that we should be a beacon to the free world and completely abolish all our tariffs. And my point is that we don't need them, and that therefore we can simply back off. We, the U.S. government, and we as U.S. citizens are in charge of our own destiny, and therefore we simply have to cut back on needless spending, and then the only initiative that we can take are the initiatives that I mentioned. So I'm not even clear where we are now in disagreement about. Do you no longer want trade deficits? I take it. Is that right?
I'm not that worried about any trade deficit. Okay, we could. The trade deficits, particularly bilateral trade deficits with certain countries, are fine.
Of course.
And even just if you have an overall trade deficit, it's the size, growth, and continued persistence of it that I think are the real problem. So if you were able to bring the trade deficit lower, I'm not a fetishist for an absolutely balanced trade, but if you were able to bring it lower, I think that would help you move to the world where you're able to shrink government.
All right, I want to intervene. So, Gene, hang on just a second. I want to intervene here. So, because I think one way we can bring out the differences between you guys is if I ask a couple of questions. Now, that trade deficit thing I want to get back to because John, you probably heard Trump say when countries apparently have come to him saying, we want zero tariffs with you, we'll do what you ask. And he has evidently said to them, well, sorry, that's not enough. We have to get rid of the trade deficit with you because I view a trade deficit as a loss. Now that, if he's going to hold out for no trade deficit with anybody, then we're going to be in this for a very, very long time. And I think even you don't support that.
Right.
Is that just Trumpian over-the-top kind of language? Yes. I think Donald Trump is being a negotiator here. Tom, you might remember, I was a corporate lawyer for a number of years. I did mergers and acquisitions and leveraged buyout finance. And very often my clients took what I would call extreme positions on things with the idea that they would come back. I mean, literally, I walked out of a meeting once where a private equity guy was screaming at another private equity guy and this deal that they were supposed to be working on together. We walk out and he turns to me and he's like, do you think I sounded irrational enough? Because I really need them to be afraid of me. All right.
And I think that's part of what's going on with Donald Trump here is he says no trade deficit at all, but that's because he wants a lower trade.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. So let me start with my question for Gene. Gene, the narrative that you need to address as an opponent of these tariffs is that, look, for decades, we tried it your way. We tried a low tariff world, and relatively speaking, and the result has been the deindustrialization of America, the hollowing out of the U.S. economy, the increasing difficulties that the middle class has in making a decent living, in affording the kinds of things that their own parents took for granted. So we have, and these things coincided with the trade regime that you favor. So what's the harm in trying a different trade regime? So I think that's a fair summary of how the average person hearing these arguments thinks. And if you don't answer that, they're not going to be convinced. So what is your answer to that?
I'm sorry. The different trade regime that we started is that we lowered tariffs and we allowed cheap goods to come into the country. Yes. And I see. And therefore, you're saying then that we tried that, so we should restore the tariffs to where they were. We should. What direction should we take?
Gene, I'm sure you're familiar with the standard argument, right?
Yeah.
I know you know what the standard argument is, which is that free trade has amounted in practice, or whatever you want to call this regime of trade. If you don't want to call it free trade, if you want to call it managed trade, whatever it is, it has been a sellout of America and of American workers in particular, which is why we need to try something different. So so you have to answer that if you're going to be at the table.
I see. You're saying that we've moved toward more free trade, and that has coincided with slower standard of living, and therefore what my opponent wants. What do you want to tighten? Do you want to increase duties and tariffs? Is that the direction you want? Is that our solution? What do we do? What do we do in order to remedy the problem that Tom has outlined?
So I think what Tom said is absolutely right, that there does need to be an answer to this question of, I would even add to that to go even further, which is not only have we seen people become far less happy with the way our economy runs and the opportunities for people without a college education plunge, but we've also seen an immense growth of government alongside of that. So the idea that, an idea that I used to believe, by the way, you mentioned this earlier, that we should just unilaterally lower our tariffs and that we will, and that will bring us to this libertarian paradise, has backfired. Instead, what it has created is an enormous constituency for more government. And we've seen the government grow, and we've seen the debt grow, and we've seen the deficit grow, and we've seen government spending grow, and we've seen new agencies come up. And at the same time, we've seen the opportunities for the middle class in America plunge. And so one of the reasons I think people actually vote for Donald Trump is that he says, this didn't work. Let's try something new. And so that's what he's proposing. Let's try something new.
Well, again, the only thing that I'm trying to wonder about is, I can mention all of those things and go over them, but again, your position is that we ought to increase tariffs?
Yes, absolutely. We should increase tariffs in order to combat the foreign mercantilism that has led us to this position now.
Okay. So, Gene, your job is to tell us what's wrong with that way of thinking. Your job is to tell us now what's wrong with that way of thinking.
Okay. Well, if we increase tariffs, we increase the cost of imported goods, and if we increase the cost of imported goods, we make it more costly for people to pursue a decent standard of living, and therefore that means then that we take a step backward rather than a step forward. How high would you make the tariffs? How far are you willing to go? Do you want to prohibit all? Let's start with the extreme. Do you want to prohibit all imports? Of course not. But how much further down do you want to go with that? From there,
what I would say is that actually I'm not convinced that tariffs will, particularly tariffs on China, will actually increase the cost of goods. You might say, wait, how could that be, John? What do you mean? They're a tax we put on imports. How could that not increase the cost of imports? Well, first of all, because they are not a tax, they're not a sales tax, they're a tax on importers. So the importers have a couple choices there. Sometimes they may attempt to say to their customers, we're going to raise the price that we charge you. But they can't always do that. In fact, I would say typically they cannot. They are already charging the maximum price that they can for their goods that a consumer is willing to pay. So they will not increase costs. In fact, what we're seeing Walmart do is tell its foreign suppliers that in light of these tariffs, they must reduce their prices because Walmart is not willing to take the full hit to their margins, and they are not willing to try to raise prices on their customers. So, but the other thing is, and I think this is implicit in what you're saying, is there is an assumption that the current pattern of production around the world is efficient. That the reason why things are made in China is because we can make them efficiently there. I think that's incorrect. I think the reason why things are made in China is because China directs them, and I can explain why later, but directs them to be made in China. Therefore, there are things that can be moved out of China into Mexico and even into the US that would be produced cheaper here than there, are currently produced in China anyway, even though you could produce them cheaper in the US. And so by putting tariffs, that reshore production or friendshore production, we can actually lower prices by convincing companies that it is not worth it to give into the Chinese predatory system. By raising the cost of giving into that, we are actually we can more efficiently produce goods outside of China.
Sorry, you're talking about imports from China. We import from the rest of the world as well, and not just from China. But you go with that again. You are literally saying what that if China if China were to do what?
No. So right now, what happens is
Yeah.
if you have a factory and so let's say you're a company and you want to sell a widget in China and in the United States. China,
are you a U.S. company or a Chinese
let's
company?
say you're a U.S. company, okay? And you want to sell in the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
Let's say you're a French company. I don't care. It doesn't actually matter for this.
No, it's a
point.
French company. Okay.
But we'll say it's a U.S. company for the sake of simplicity, but it applies to all over the place. China tells you cannot sell into the Chinese market unless you build your factory here.
Oh.
The U.S. does not tell you that. We say, it's fine. Go ahead, produce in China, and you can sell into the United States. A rational businessman says, I'm going to build my factory in China so I have access to the Chinese market, even if it would have been just as good or even cheaper to build in the U.S. Why is that? One, because of economies of scale, clustering of expertise and manufacturing skill. So they build the factory in China. That is where the manufacturing happens. They're able to ship for no tariff into the United States and have access to the Chinese market, where if they had factories on both places, then they would not take advantage of the economies of scale. And two, if they had a factory just in the United States, they could not sell it to China. So this has forced inefficient production into China. If we have tariffs on China, we can force that inefficiency out of the global production system, making production more efficient. And therefore, we will actually not be raising the cost to global consumers or to U.S. consumers of goods, because we will be restoring the system of comparative advantage and efficiency to world trade that China has crushed.
Wow. Okay, just a moment. Let me unravel that. Just a moment. We impose a tariff on something's made in China, and we impose a tariff on it. So the first approximation, it becomes more expensive for American consumers to buy it. So that's the first stage in that.
The first approximation is that it becomes more expensive for American importers to buy it. We don't know whether it becomes more expensive for American consumers to buy it. And in fact, we've seen that
American importers. Are American importers at all price sensitive? If they have to pay more, how do they recoup their higher costs? What do? They take the hit? Is that?
Yeah, in a competitive economy, what happens is you cannot pass on all of your increased costs on it. It tends to actually be a tax on your margin. You can't pass on all of your increased costs because prices are not an accumulation of the cost to make something. They are the result of what consumer priorities on spending are. And so they're typically, almost all goods are priced at the maximum they can be priced. And so you will not see a very large price increase unless you're doing something to inject more income or more money into the economy that is giving people more spending power.
Let me ask you a question from left field. Let's say we had a world in which there were no tariffs, no duties, no nothing, completely free trade. Let's say we basically have an enormous free trade zone within the 50 states of the U.S. with minor little issues here and there. And I would say that's extremely enriching. It means that California can trade with New York. All of that free trade happens. It's one of the biggest free trade zones in the world. It's done enormous good. Now, let's leap and say, let's imagine all the countries of the world decide we're going to just be a one world situation. No tariffs, no duties, no nothing. Just the cost of shipping. I'm for that. Are you for that as well?
Yeah, I think I would be for that. If we could get everybody to give up all of their tariffs and all of their trade barriers, I think that would actually lead to, one, I don't think we would have anywhere near the trade deficits we have. And I think that we would actually have much more balanced trade. I am for a system where, and I actually believe that Trump's tariffs are going to move us in that direction, because lots of countries are going to come to us and say, all right, we get it. The game's up. We're going to give up our trade barriers. We're going to move to a system that I believe will actually balance trade. And so, yes, I think we're in agreement that the end state here could very well be a system in which the world trades freely with each other and that the distribution of production is controlled by efficiency and comparative advantage rather than state direction.
How would you apply that? Okay, now we've reached an odd, for a supposed disagreement, we've reached an odd level of agreement. We want all tariffs and all duties abolished. We want the world to become a complete free trade zone. Question: we have had somewhat lower tariffs. We've had trade agreements, and that now what else would you want? Now let me ask you a more difficult one. Milton Friedman, of course, argued the U.S. should have a policy of absolutely no tariffs. We should be a beacon to the free world, none whatsoever. But you oppose that, I assume.
I consider that a failure, that it did not work.
Well, it was never tried. What do you mean it did not work?
I mean, okay,
so never abolished tariffs.
I love when people say that is our idea, that, real free trade has never been tried. I get that idea. I understand it, but all I'm saying is a lot of us have heard that argument about ideological commitments and plans before. Maybe real free trade has never been tried. That's an indictment of real free trade's ability to become a political, realistic thing.
I'm sorry. I thought you said
but what I'm saying is that's fine, but we're not going to get real free trade ever unless ever. So the question is, what do we do short of that first best world? The second best world, I would say, is one in which the U.S. is responding as it is now to try to push the rest of the world to adopt a fairer system.
Okay, if I understand, again, I take exception. I will say that that we used to have slavery around the world. The idea that radical solutions have never happened doesn't mean that radical solutions can't ever happen, because radical solutions have happened all the time over the course of history. So I do take issue with you in that regard. I think I lack a sense of politics. You lack a sense of history. Radical solutions do happen. But secondly, my only other question for you is this: you are saying then that trade wars, as I would put it, that if we respond with tariffs to other countries that impose tariffs, then we might have a truce and we might mutually agree to reduce our tariffs. Is that your argument? Is that a fair summary?
Correct.
Okay. Correct. All right. Okay. All right. Well. Certainly, as far as I know, I can't necessarily argue with that because I can't predict the future. A trade war can end in a truce. A trade war can end in a situation in which you and I would welcome no trade barriers whatsoever between that goods and services can cross borders without any tariffs, no duties whatsoever. And you think that our responding with tariffs can achieve that very desirable end. Is that a fair summary of your view?
Yeah, that's a fair summary. The one caveat I'd want to put on that is that I actually do think some tariff to replace part of our internal income tax is a good idea. I would rather have more of our tax agents at the customs and the ports than looking into how I earn my income. So, So I would rather have the external tax service rather than the internal revenue service. So, but that's not a trade issue so much as a, how we tax ourselves issue. But in terms of the, so maybe in my, world, when Gene, when you're president and you have, you convinced everybody to drop all of the tariffs, I would come forward and say, but Gene, we could get rid of the capital gains tax if we just had a little bit of a tariff here. Let's replace the capital gains tax with a tariff, or let's replace part of the payroll tax with a tariff. I'd rather do some of that. But in general, the big picture of what we've been talking about here, you're absolutely correct. I think that we're moving, that one of the points of this is not to move us to a trade war, but to respond forcibly to move us to a trade truce.
All right. Well, then I actually have been somewhat criticized by some of my free market friends by saying that over time, some of the trade negotiations that have mutually reduced tariffs have been, by and large, a step in the right direction. Do you agree with that as well?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea too. And right now, for instance, we see a lot of countries. I think Vietnam was the first. Mm-hmm. They were sending their representatives over right away to say, okay, what can we do? Right? Let's fix this problem. We don't want to have your tariffs on us. What can we do? I regard that as a very positive development. And my Breitbart Business Digest articles actually have, or if you see me, I'm often on Larry Kudlow's television show as well. And I've often been pushing this idea that one of the ways we can get free trade, and Larry Kudlow knows Trump very well, and he says Trump does believe this.
Oh, wow.
One of the ways, the path to free trade is through what we're doing right now, which is reciprocal tariffs that will that will cause people to come to the table and say, we'll do a better deal with you. We're not going to mistreat you.
All right, well then
let me
jump in, John, because
okay.
I think the kinds of people who have talked about the problems with our trade with China have not really been making some of the arguments that you're making. So for example, yes. I mean, and this doesn't include just China, but if I look on social media right now, and I realize social media is not the best expression of ourselves, but if I look there, I will find people openly mocking the idea of low prices. That, you would sell out your soul for low price. But the thing is, low prices is actually how my standard of living improves. I mean, if my wage increases, well, that really just means I'm earning more, vis-a-vis the prices. So, I mean, implicitly, it also means the prices have, relatively speaking, gone down, So to see people openly mocking that, like only a soulless globalist would care about low prices, that's not a good look for your side. I get that there's plenty of, other issues, but here's the thing I want to ask you. The standard argument has been Americans, we need tariffs on China because we can't compete with Chinese slave labor. Now, I personally think slave labor is not very efficient, but we can't compete with them because they have terrible internal policies and they treat people terribly, so they can afford to produce things very, very cheaply. And that's not fair. So we need tariffs on them. But you seem to be saying, I can live without any tariffs on them as long as they do some internal reorganization to allow Americans to compete with them on a level playing field. So which argument is it? We can't compete with China because of the slave labor, or we just want them to let us get access to their markets? Like, is it one or the other, or is it both, or neither, or what?
So it's a little bit of both. I think the argument that we can't compete with them in slave labor is true about the stuff that's truly slave labor. So the Uyghur cotton issue is a huge one, right? Like, look, slaves making cotton, and obviously this is a bad historical conversation for the U.S. to lecture the rest of the world on, but slaves making cotton is a very hard thing to compete with. You can ask countries all around the world back in the 19th century, why aren't you making more cotton? Well, the Americans have slaves, so it makes it difficult. But I don't think that's the core of the argument for tariffs at all. Because if you ask, for instance, Tim Cook, why do they make, iPhones in China, right? It's not because of cheap labor. That's not what he says. He says it's not because labor is cheaper at all. He says it's because...
iPhones where, did you say? In China?
So Tim Cook of Apple,
he says they make iPhones
that they don't make it there because of cheap labor.
They make it in China, you said.
Yes.
Yeah.
He says they make it in China because of the expertise that's there. Why is the expertise there? This goes back to the conversation I was having earlier, which is that China has directed countries that if they want access to the Chinese market, they must produce in China. Sometimes, by the way, they go even further and say, not only do we want you to produce in China for the Chinese market, but we want you to produce in China for everybody if you want access to the Chinese market. So China is very much directing where production happens. And so this goes to your second point, and I think it is the more important one, and that's why it's the one I emphasize, Tom, that the and frankly, I'm not very hopeful China will ever give this up. I actually think that the end game here is that we break up with China, that the free countries and free economies of the world will divide a line through the world like we did during the Cold War and say, no mas, we are not dealing with China anymore. Because I don't think China will be able to give up the system where they directly demand excess production and a buyer of last resort. And if we try to move away from us being a buyer of last resort, Europe is going to get all that stuff dumped on them instead. So I think you're going to have a global team, more or less, to say to China, we're not going to deal with you, and let China deal with itself.
Well, our debate seems to have taken an odd turn. This seems to be a surprising amount of overlap between us, John. You seem to prefer a world of absolutely no tariffs and duties, a completely free trade world. If such could be achieved, am I right so far in terms of your views when I say that?
Yeah, no, I am pretty, my background is I'm very libertarian. I used to attend Mises University things. It's actually how Tom and I originally met. So my dream is not one of, call it like the maybe it's the old-fashioned protectionist point of view, which is that, we have inefficient industries and they're not very good at doing stuff, but heck, at least they're ours and let's protect them. That's not my goal.
No.
My goal is to say that we can restore actual competition around the globe by overthrowing the mercantilism of China and Germany and Europe.
Overthrowing it?
Yes.
Wow. That sounds like a pretty tall order.
It is. It's a very tall order.
Would you do it through trade wars? Is that how you do it?
Yeah, I do think that we could bring Europe around through trade. I think with China,
what? How do we force them? We're not going to fight. We're not going to use guns. What do we do?
They need access to our market. What we do is we say they need access to our market. So what we do is say to them,
okay,
you produce a lot of stuff that you cannot consume. That is what our trade deficit is. So what you need to do is either restructure your economy so that you are consuming more of what you produce and stop depending so much on the US, or stop suppressing consumption in your country through your tax rates, through your regulations, and allow your consumers to buy more US goods. Those are two different ways. I can't tell them which way to go on this, but that would lead to a more balanced trade. I think Europe will come along, kicking and screaming. It will be hard. They will be the hardest place other than China to have change because they have a very strong special interest internal constituency that absolutely wants to run a trade surplus. China, I think, is actually helpless. I don't believe that we can change them. Hopeless, rather.
Well, classically, again, the classical problem with free trade is that there are special interest groups and special industries that have power in government and that make this case for nationalism and all the rest of it, and they want protection, and then they say, it's for good and national reasons, and you don't buy any of that. But so you do want a world in which we have complete free trade, but you think that I think that the best way to get there, it now seems to be the only point of disagreement. We both want the same thing: complete free trade, right? So hands across the table about that. Great. Okay. Right. And now you want to bring it about through what I would call trade wars, whereas I would say that the only practical way for the U.S. to have any chance of bringing it about is not through trade wars, which tend to create problems and tend to feed on themselves. I would say the only way is the Milton Friedman way, which is that the U.S. become the beacon to the free world and say, no tariffs, no duties, no nothing. You can buy whatever you want. And that would be my solution. So I guess, is that a fair summary of where we disagree? That you want to fight them with tariffs, and I want to fight them with what you might call pacifism.
I think that's right. I think what we're disagreeing on is the strategy or tactics to get to the world we want, rather than the the principle underneath it, which I think is great. World. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to do this discussion.
Yeah,
because I think it's instructive for people to see that we are not necessarily. I think a lot of people have, particularly libertarians, have a vision that they are combating or debating with 19th century protectionists. And I wanted to have a debate with you because I'm a 21st century. I wouldn't call myself a protectionist because I think it's a slur, but a 21st century defender of tariffs, because I think the argument now is a lot different than it was when we were saying, well, we don't want to buy the hats from, England because it'll put our domestic hatterers, out of business. Let's have, let's put up a protection wall, even if our hats are terrible. I don't think that's the argument today. So I think we're in agreement. It's about the goal. The point is how.
All right, let me ask John a question. Let me ask John a question.
Okay.
And I realize I'm asking John more of the questions, but it's a Tom Woods show. I get to do that. But I know John will be happy to answer this. The issue, another issue, is the political viability of Trump's program. Like, how long can people endure pain for what is promised to be a greater good in the future? And I see some diehard Trumpian people on social media saying, my retirement plan is down $50K, and it's going to hit me, and I'm not going to live long enough to recover that. But I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to endure it because I think there is a better world coming. But that's what the hardcore people say. The independents, the people on the fence. So the issue, he's got to, I'm sure you would agree with me, he's got to deliver on this, and the clock is ticking. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. I think the greatest risk right now is actually the American public blanching and saying, being unpersuaded. I don't think the Trump administration has done a great job selling its program and explaining it to people. I think that they really need to be out there. I said that Donald Trump should do a fireside chat, right? Like, sit down and explain to everybody exactly what he's doing and why. Perhaps in the terms that I just made, or maybe he doesn't agree with my argument for this, but do it so that people are a little bit more reassured that there is a plan, that they are following a strategy, what the end goal here is. And then I would also say, very, very important, and this gets to another point of agreement that I think Gene and I have here. I think it's ultra important that Donald Trump move with extreme haste to cut taxes, to reduce regulation, to make sure that when you are saying, we want to reshore factories to the United States because we think that'll be more efficient, that you do not have these immense regulatory burdens. Because instead what will happen is people will say, well, we can't make it in China because the tariffs are too high, but we can't make it in the US because the regulation and the taxes are too high. So therefore, we're just not going to make it and the whole world gets poor. That is a possible nightmare outcome. We need to work, with the utmost haste to bring down government interference with growth in the economy, and particularly in manufacturing and construction, I'll put on there, in the US, so that we can respond to this. And I think also that will go a long way. If we have an enormous tax cut announced that brought down the corporate rate, for instance, to 15%, that cut the payroll tax, that reduced taxes on Social Security, that reduced taxes on overtime, that didn't tax wage and tips. If we did all of this, I think that actually the fear that you're seeing in markets would reverse. People would have more spending power. People would feel a lot better about things. I think it's very important to get there because right now they're only seeing the tariffs. You need to make the conversation include the entire Trump economic package, which is a growth and freedom package. Move to there, and we'll be better.
Yes. Yeah. Well, let me comment on your answer. I think you're giving Trump a little bit more. He's a businessman. He's not an informed economist. like you and me, and I'll even include Tom in that. Anyway, so I'm kidding. So I don't think that Trump has the sophistication for that. I don't really think he wants a world of free trade. I do think that he believes that protectionism is a word that has some meaning for him. That I do think that he does not understand or want a world in which there is complete free trade. I take it that is what you want. I imagine you probably want one currency as well, don't you? Well, I'm sorry to change the subject. Let's just get back to trade.
Maybe I mean it would depend on I'm very suspicious of a state central bank, but if we could agree to if there were like a special kind of metal in the world that everybody could use as a medium
like
of
gold or silver,
exchange.
or Bitcoin. But anyway, look, in any case, the disagreement between us is, I guess, that you seem to think that Trump has the sophistication to think in terms of the gains from trade, whereas I have no confidence whatsoever in his ability to think in those terms, and you seem to be nodding. So there two are agreeing. Unless I thought you were nodding.
What I would say is I agree that if I am going to make a mistake about this, I am going to make the mistake about assuming that Trump does understand it. I prefer to look, actually, even with politicians that I do not agree with, I prefer to assume that they are thoughtful and rational and that the plans they are pursuing actually reflect the best version of them that you can imagine. And so I'm, maybe you're right. I don't think any of us live inside of Donald Trump's heart or head, so it's a little hard to tell. Maybe the truth is somewhere between. Maybe I'm over rationalizing him and you are over irrationalizing him. But I think that at least so far as I can tell right now, my assumption is justified. Maybe it won't be. Maybe everybody else drops their tariffs. We get to a free trade world and Trump says, nah, I'm not going to do it. I'm raising the tariff up to 50%. So I could be wrong. I don't think I am. I think this is the world we're moving to.
All right, this has been an odd debate. In any case, hands across the table on the desirability of a completely free trade world with one currency, so that and I think that the gains from trade would be very substantial if we did that. And you're nodding, and so Tom, you got two guys together who just admire each other and completely agree, and you're frowning. You were hoping to have a debate, but we agree completely. We want the same thing.
I don't think you agree completely, because you look at the situation and you say, this has disaster written all over it, and John is saying this is a long time coming. That's a disagreement.
Well, through what? Okay, where we disagree, I'm only putting you on to where we disagree is the tactics, not the end game, not the goal, but the tactics. John seems to think that what I would call trade wars are a way to get there, in a way, I guess it's a judgment
and of course you can't know that in advance. Like that's not an a priori judgment you can make. You wait and see what happens. But where I think there is a disagreement, though, is where both of you stand on where you think Trump is on this. Because I think Trump likes tariffs. I see. Somebody sent me a 23-minute video.
We're ganging up against you, John.
Hang on a minute, Gene.
Yes.
Somebody sent me a 23-minute video saying, before you do this debate, you have to watch this video to understand what Trump's strategy is. So I watched it, and then I thought, I still think it's just that he likes tariffs, and we're attributing to him grandiose thoughts that never occur to him. That's my feeling.
So while that's possible, and I do think he likes tariffs, but I think he likes tariffs as a tactic to get better terms of trade for the U.S. This is what I'm told by people who have been very close to him. You may have seen me. I'm on TV with my good friend Larry Kudlow, who says, that is what Donald Trump is. Now, look, maybe Larry Kudlow is projecting himself a little bit, right? And I think that's possible. That Kudlow says, "Well, I know that I'm a free trader, so I."
But John, bear in mind, there are people who say Trump is America first, just like me. But that means America first is in the eye of the beholder, unfortunately.
Yes, no, it is. It's very different. And what I would say is look, I'm an America first person, but I think but for me, what that means is acceptance of a whole bunch of devil terms, right? Like, I long ago agreed that I would call myself an isolationist, even though that's used as a smear term against those of us who, we like the term non-interventionist, right? But I said, no, I'll just embrace isolationism. So that's what I am. Fine, I'm an isolationist. Then they throw protectionist at me, and I don't think I'm a protectionist in the old-fashioned sense. But if they want to call anybody who supports tariffs a protectionist, then fine. I'm a protectionist. But I do think that this, as you said, America first is in the eye of the beholder. There are definitely people on my side who think that we should have completely, walled off trade, autarky, not have, any imports at all, or that all imports are a cost. I think that I'll modify, by the way, what I said earlier. There are certain things that I do think we probably need to have protection over. I'm worried about stuff like whether we could have a steel or a shipbuilding industry, and that might go away in a totally free trade world. But then again, it might not, right? Maybe if we got to the world I wanted, we would actually have a thriving shipbuilding and steel and aluminum producing sector. I'd like to find out, right? Like, that's a problem that when Gene and I have won and we've gotten to our free trade world, we can then look and say, well, you know what? Let's figure out whether we need a copper industry in the U.S. or if we can be dependent on imports for it. We're very far from that world right now, and depending on imports for strategic goods in a world of Chinese predatory mercantilism, I think is very dangerous. Let's see what happens when we get the rest of the world to agree to trade with the U.S. on fair terms. Then we can decide whether or not depending on foreign countries for these things is dangerous or not.
Gene?
Okay, well, we've had a lot of agreement. China has responded with warfare to what we've done. I tend to think that if you just go over the list of things, including steel, there's plenty of steel in Brazil. It's unlikely that we'll ever get down to it, but manufacturing is close to its record highs in the U.S. I worry far more about the ways in which protectionism hurts people, and I do think that, of course, you give Trump a little bit too much credit for sophistication, but that's a judgment call. I think he's kind of a limited, bullheaded businessman, not a visionary, even though I like some of the things he does, but dislike others. But this has been a strange debate, probably the strangest that Tom has ever launched, because you and I seem to be in agreement about the ultimate goal. Ultimately, we want a world of no tariffs, no nothing. We want goods and services to cross borders freely with no duties, no nothing. But we have some judgment call differences about how to get there. And so that at least is a significant difference between you and some of the other people that Tom has had me debate.
It's a great debate because it's a debate without the statists, right? Like, this is a debate about how we achieve the goals of a free society that all three of us can point up in both directions, that all three of us agree on here. And I think that's very useful because I think too often the debate is, you, Gene, or me answering people who actually fundamentally disagree with us on how society and human flourishing occurs. The fact that we can agree on this fundamental principles of where we want to go is useful because it's more of a disagreement about what kind of guy Donald Trump is, how we get there, whether or not, as you call them, trade wars can bring us there, or whether it's, your trade pacifism. I could be wrong. Maybe history will prove that the trade war, that the tariff as diplomacy didn't work out and everything crashes.
Well,
and then
you
we
can see
in a couple of years, Gene, and we'll say, Gene got it right.
Well, my friend, I thought that Milton Friedman was inspiring when he said that no tariffs, no nothing, completely free trade. We can be a beacon to the free world. Now, I thought Milton had a certain charisma. That's probably the reason why I'm influenced by that idea, that we're strong enough, we're powerful enough, we can survive. We're a beacon to the free world. We create the good example, and we don't reduce ourselves to protectionism. But that's just a judgment call. And admittedly, I guess I was inspired by Milton Friedman more than you were.
All right, look, let me, because I know we've taken up, you've both been very generous with your time. I guess there's one thing I want to ask John as we depart. And John, just give a 60-second response if you possibly can.
Sure.
I think some of us were concerned when we got this big list of alleged tariffs that other countries were charging us. And then we look more closely, these aren't really tariff rates they're charging us. These numbers are based on the trade deficit we have with these countries, with the presumption being that the only reasons for these trade deficits must be nefarious. And that seemed like a drastic oversimplification. Can you defend that, or did you have misgivings about that too?
No, so I think that first of all, it's not the only reason, it's about half the reason. If you do the math, what they say, because we impose then about half what we come up with as the trade barrier limit. They called it like reciprocal tariffs, but that's actually a little bit of a misnomer. It's more like reciprocal trade barriers. And so what we're saying is that about half their trade deficit is the result of trade barriers. It's very hard to quantify. I agree. It's a massive simplification. I brought this up with the administration months ago when Donald Trump first said that they were going to do reciprocal tariffs. I said, there are 3 million tariffs out there, right? Every country has thousands of them. How do you reciprocal tariff things? Plus, there are Byzantine trade barriers. I mean, if you try to sell something into the EU, I don't care whether it's a chicken or a wristband or anything. It's not just the numerical tariff that's going to stop you. It is the labeling. It is the environmental regulations around the thing that you made. You could have made it out of pure sun, and you would still have trouble selling, pure solar panels, and you would have trouble selling it in the EU. So how do you quantify that? It is a impossibly complex task. And in fact, that was one of the criticisms a lot of people when Donald Trump announced reciprocal tariffs is they say, you can't do it. Can't do it, too complex. Sorry, I've gone over 30 seconds, but I'll just answer. So what they did is try to come up with a shorthand, which is, let's assume that over time, trade would tend to be a lot more balanced. What do we need to do to do that? Well, let's use that as our formula because we can't quantify everything else. So I think it's a proxy. I think it's a decent proxy. I've asked everybody else, if you can come up with a better proxy, a better way of doing the number that doesn't involve 3 million tariff rates, I'm open to it. And heck, I know people in the administration read Breitbart Business Digest, my newsletter. So, pitch it to me. I'll write it up if it's a better system. Maybe that'll be the tariff level when we get it.
Well, let me make one final word, just out of left field. The nice thing about having these 50 states, if you look at the history of the U.S. economy, you couldn't impose tariffs on what was being shipped in from California to New York. You can't impose a tariff on Alaska. It was a wonderful, and still, by the way, is a wonderful tariff-free zone. And I take it you're nodding, John, and therefore you tend to agree, of course, and hands across the table then about the idea that we basically want a world in which we would naturally gravitate toward one or two currencies, and we don't want government bureaucrats involved at all in their special interest pursuit of tariff barriers or what have you. So we agree about that completely. And again, I emphasize, the U.S. economy is extremely lucky that it was such a vast continent in a free trade zone. So I think that at the end of the day, Tom, as much as you've tried to cause a little bit of discord between me and John, we basically are in agreement with each other about most of the issues. So hands across the table.
Well, gentlemen, however we wind up resolving this, I want to thank you both for your extreme generosity with your time. For Gene Epstein, his site is thesohoforum.org. Gene hosts in-person debates in the New York City area on topics of interest to all people, with very lively debaters on both sides who shed more light than heat. So definitely check out thesohoforum.org. And if you can't make it, they have a podcast that includes recordings of all their debates, and that makes for interesting listening. So, Gene, thank you. And John Carney, do you have a particular, I know you're on so-called X, but is there a particular place you want me to send people?
Yeah, well, everybody should subscribe to Breitbart Business Digest. It's a free newsletter. You go to Breitbart.com. There's a little newsletter thing.
Where do you say you're based, John? Where are you visiting?
So I'm based in the New York City area. I'm going to come to your Soho Forum debates, by the way. I've been meaning to go for a long time. I really, I said off the air, I'll just say, tell everybody here, I'm an admirer of Gene's work over the years. I followed him in Barron's, and so I'm very, and I think I learned a lot actually from you over the years. Maybe that's one of the reasons we agree so much. But so I have Breitbart Business Digest. It's a newsletter. It comes to everybody's email box. It's free. It tries to explain what's happening in the Trump administration, what's happening in the economy, and where it's going next. I'm also on X as @Carney, CARNEY, so people can follow me there. Well, and of course, go to Breitbart.com because that's the website that pays my bills.
Take a look at our next three debates. I'm going historical in June. I'm having a debate about the Cold War and what happened there in terms of protectionism. That's going to be an interesting one because I've been told by many advisors the average Soho Forum audience isn't interested in history; they're only interested in current events. So I'm going to offer you a free ticket to that one in June. Take a look at these.
I'll be there.
Okay, thesohoforum.org, and of course, I did have Tom as my debater. I pled with him for years to do a Soho Forum debate. He finally said yes, but his opponent didn't show up.
Oh, no.
And that's your question. No, we all know why. I can
understand that. Tom's
why.
Thank you, John.
I can see somebody being like, "Oh, never mind."
You chicken out at the last minute debating Tom Woods. We know that.
Well, thank you both once again. I appreciate you all very much. The show notes page is tomwoods.com/2629. So I'll have links to what all these guys do over there. So to you gentlemen, thank you very much. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, watching.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.